We're wrapping up today this summer series on big questions, wrestling with our faith, and all the questions we've dealt with this month were questions put forth by members of our congregation, something they wanted us to wrestle with. And today we land on this question, can we change God's mind? And although that question came very directly, there were related questions people had about prayer and how does prayer work, and does prayer actually affect God, or does it just affect us? And so we're going to try to wrestle with all of that a little bit today. Looking at a text from Exodus. By the way, there's something on the communion table this morning that's a hint to the story if you haven't looked ahead. I don't know if you've noticed it yet, but if you're really paying attention, you know which story we're covering today in the text. But before we get to this question, I'd like to pose another question for your consideration, and it's this. If you could change one thing about yourself personally that would help you become more the person you think God intends you to be, what would you change about yourself? Just think about that as we go through the story today. So we're reading today from Exodus 32. I'm going to back up a little more into the story than what you have in your bulletin just to give us some context. So I'm actually starting at verse 1. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered around Aaron and said to him, "Come make gods for us who shall go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the gold rings from their ears and brought them to Aaron. He took the gold from them, formed it in a mold, and cast an image of a calf. And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a festival to the Lord." They rose early the next day and offered burnt offerings and brought sacrifices of well-being, and the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to revel. The Lord then said to Moses, "Go down at once. Your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have acted perversely. They have been quick to turn aside from the way that I commanded them. They have cast for themselves an image of a calf and have worshipped it and sacrificed to it and said, 'These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.'" Then the Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, how stiff-necked they are. Now let me alone so that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them, and then of you I will make a great nation." But Moses implored the Lord his God and said, "O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt with your great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians say, 'It was with evil intent that he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and consume them from the face of the earth'? Turn from your fierce wrath. Change your mind and do not bring disaster on your people. Remember Abraham and Isaac and Israel, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying to them, 'I will multiply your descendants like the stars of the heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster that he planned to bring on his people." So, did you hear about this eclipse that supposedly happened earlier this week? I mean, I didn't see it, but I heard about it. I had a friend quip on Facebook that on that day, thousands of Americans for the first time got to see what their neighbors looked like. Yeah, it took me a while. Like, what's he talking about? Like, oh, okay, you're out in your front yard, your backyard. You're like, "Oh, hi, neighbor. Hi, neighbor." Yeah, you've never seen them before. And what an amazing day that was, whether you were looking at it through a cloud or not. It was like the whole country for a couple of hours came together. We were all just focused on this amazing, beautiful thing that was happening in front of us. We were all experiencing this wonderful, positive thing together. But then the day ended, and we were really right back to having to deal with many of the deep, deep divisions that exist within this country and within this world. When we first moved here 4 years ago, I had a ministerial colleague who lived in the area say to me over lunch, "You know, we're still fighting the Civil War in this corner of the state." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" And he said, "You'll figure it out." And I have to say, over the last month or so, as a lot of this debate has been happening over the Confederate War monuments, I've begun to maybe realize a little bit of what he was talking about. And I was listening to an NPR radio show this week that is called Code Switch, and it's hosted entirely by journalists of color, and they deal with issues of identity and race. And they were musing on the irony that the same folks that are over here saying slavery was a long time ago, nobody that's living today was ever a slave, you need to let it go, are the same people over here who are saying, but these monuments, that's our history, we need to hold on to them, don't erase our history. And they were mentioning the irony that when the white supremacists came to Charlottesville supposedly to protect this Robert E. Lee memorial, their very actions probably resulted in even more of these monuments being taken down, like happened in Kansas City earlier this week. So they're talking about all this on this radio show, and then they particularly focus in on one city that in a way could be at least one of the ground zeros for this whole debate, and that's Charleston, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia. And in this town, if you visited Richmond, they have a street that's called Monument Avenue. And Monument Avenue is a long street that's beautiful. It has trees down the side. It's got a nice green way down the middle. It's lined on the sides by these beautiful bucolic antebellum mansions. And along the street, there are all these monuments, hence the name. And many of them are monuments to Confederate Army leaders like Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. And in fact, the very first one to go up was a monument to Robert E. Lee. It's 60 feet tall, so this is not some little statue. It's 60 feet tall, and it was erected in 1890, so this is decades after the war was over. And even then, it was controversial because many of the black people living in the city said, this is only being erected as a way to remind us about white supremacy. You're just reminding us that though others won the war, you still control whether or not we're treated as second-class citizens. And they actually said, we don't think that local money, city money, should be used to erect a monument like this, but they lost that argument. But perhaps even more controversial, in the 1990s, another monument, a new monument, was erected on Monument Avenue there. And this was a monument to Arthur Ashe, the famous African-American tennis player who's arguably the most famous person to ever come out of this city. And this statue was very controversial. There were black people or white people that came out on the day it was being erected, waving their Confederate flag, saying that Ashe did not belong in the same company as these Confederate leaders. And there are African Americans coming out and saying, we agree, we don't want Arthur Ashe to be in the company with these sordid people from the past. And other people that complain that the placement of Arthur Ashe's statue, which was at the very end of Monument Avenue, was a way to indicate that he was as important as the other figures there. So lest we think that this debate over monuments and how important they are to us is relatively new, it's not. In fact, I'm going to argue to you today that this story we have of Exodus is, in part, an argument over a monument. By the way, Jonathan said to me this week, these people are trudging through the wilderness, they're just taking off their rings and stuff to make this calf. How big could this thing be, right? In the movie, it's like life-size, but maybe it was just a little monument. But we have this story that, in a sense, is about an argument over a monument. You've got some characters in the story arguing, this is important to us, this calf that we've made. It's meaningful to us and who we are. There are other characters in the story saying, it's offensive to me, and I want it destroyed. And unless you think I'm drawing too, maybe obtuse a parallel here, let me go a little deeper into this story. So God has brought the people out of slavery in Egypt, and now they're out in the wilderness, and Moses has gone up on the mountaintop to talk with God for 40 days and 40 nights. And he's been up there this long time, and the people down below begin to be worried that he's not coming back, that he's gone. And the reason this is so distressing to them is that Moses was sort of their connection to God. Moses was their representative to God. They knew that as long as Moses was around, somehow they were still connected to God. He represented God to them. And so they go to Aaron, the second in charge, Moses' brother, and say, make us some other representation of God's presence. We need something that we can hold on to that's tangible, that says we know that God is with us. They weren't willing to settle for an idea about God or a feeling about God or some promise about God. They wanted something that they could grab on to. Now, often when we tell this story, we get it wrong. We think that the problem is that this calf is a substitute for God, like they're worshiping this calf now. That's not what's going on in the story. The calf, the golden calf, is not a substitute for God. It's a substitute for Moses. Moses is their representative to God. And the clue to that is they say, make us this calf that can go before us. And at other places in the story, it's always the representative God that goes before them, like the pillar of smoke or the pillar of fire. They go before the people as a representative of God. So they're saying, make us this thing that we can hold on to and know God is with us, because we don't think Moses is coming back. Now, God is up on the mountaintop, and God sees all this, and God is none too happy about what they are doing. Because I think God knows this. God knows that anytime you take a truth like God is love and God loves you, and then you turn it into a belief, and then you form it into a dogma, and then eventually you actually fashion it out of concrete or steel or whatever it is you have so that you've got it fixed in place in time, then it ceases to be a living, dynamic truth, and it becomes this thing that is unwielding, that's unchanging. It can't grow with you. And so God says to Moses, hey, Moses, your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt are misbehaving. And Moses says to God, well, wait a minute, God, they're your people who you brought out of the land of Egypt. You guys know how this works, right? Honey, your dog just made a mess on the carpet. Well, honey, your child said a bad word to the teacher in school today. We all know how. You're deflecting, right? So God's trying to deflect this off onto Moses, and Moses isn't going to have any of it. So God says to Moses, look, leave me alone, and I'm going to wipe these people out. I'm going to consume them, destroy them, whatever. So they're gone, and then we're just going to start this whole experiment over with just you and me. We'll try this thing again. And there's something in the text that suggests that there's a give and take here, that God doesn't really get to make this unilateral decision all by himself. God is in a loving relationship with Moses and through Moses the people. And if that's really true, if God really does love all of them, God doesn't get to make all the decisions, right? Because that's not love. If you're in a loving relationship with somebody and they have all the power, that's control. That's not love. So there's a suggestion here that, well, God's saying, Moses, if you leave me alone, I'll take care of these people, that if Moses doesn't leave, there could be a different outcome. And in fact, Moses doesn't leave. Moses stays. And Moses says to God, hey, God, wait a minute. Just think for a minute. You just brought these people out of Egypt, out of slavery, into freedom. Are you going to end this thing so soon? And God, what will others think of you if you do this, that you gave up so quickly on these people? And God, remember what you promised them? You promised these people that their progeny would multiply and that they would occupy the land. What about that? What about all the things that you said you would do for them because you love them? And God listens to Moses, and God thinks for a minute. And then God, are you ready for this? Wait for it. Wait for it. God changes God's mind. There it is, right there in the text. God changes God's mind because of what Moses says to him, of the argument that Moses makes to him. And remember, God was the one who was, in the text, who was ready to just end the whole thing. God's like, I don't need the messiness of the relationship with these people. I'm just going to wipe them out. Let's just clean slate, start over. It's Moses who's basically arguing, God, if you love these people, it's going to be messy, man. There's no way around it. We're human beings. It's messiness. That's what love is. That's what relationship is. And you've got to be willing to stick with us through it. And that's the decision that God makes. God figures out, and I'm going to maybe argue to you that the Israelites figured this out about God too, that if God is going to stay in relationship with these people, God has to be willing to change, because more often than not, the people are not going to change. God realizes that for divine love to stay alive and dynamic, God has to be willing to change, because the people many times are not going to be willing to change. So God is not going to be like that golden calf there, static and unchanging, something we grasp onto because we say, hey, now we know exactly what we're dealing with. God realizes that he's going to have to be over here and be more dynamic, more open to a relationship of give and take with the people. And this is what the Israelites start to figure out. So what do we do with this story today then? Well, I think there's something in this story about the fact that while we're all over here arguing about monuments and holding on desperately to these monuments, these fixed, static representations of what we thought about or think about or used to think about. And while we're clinging on to them either to keep them up or to tear them down, God is over here holding on to love. And maybe trying to redirect us this way instead. And if we are God's people in some way, shape, or form, if we're people that follow God, and God changes, then isn't it incumbent on us to be willing to change too? That everything else should be up for grabs about what we do as a people of faith except love. Because if you say to me today, well, Brian, what's the answer to the question? Can we change God's mind? I'd say, well, the answer's there in the text. At least an answer is there in the text. But the other question I would pose then, if everything about God is up for grabs, is there anything about God that doesn't change, that is unchanging, that, like Michael's saying is the same today as it was back then? What about God doesn't change? I think the answer is there in the text too. What does not change about God is what they would have called God's hesed, God's unconditional, steadfast love for the object of that love. And the object of that love is creation. It's you, it's me, it's us. That should tell us that as people of faith, everything's up for grabs except love. That means all of this could come and go, and as long as we hold on to love, we're still part of the mission of what God's trying to do in the world. And we know this was the case with our spiritual forebears, right? They started out of this bunch of people that ran away from slavery in Egypt, and then they formed themselves into clans, and then those clans become what we call a tribal league, and then out of the tribal league, we had a monarchy, and then out of the monarchy, we had a priestly theocracy, and then in the New Testament, they formed this thing called church, but all the churches look different. They're all doing different things, and they express themselves differently, and even today, we have all this variety and diversity. It says that as people of God, the structures and the forms and the traditions and the rituals and all that should be up for grabs. What we're supposed to be holding on to, what does not change, is love. And if we don't have love, the rest of it doesn't even matter anyway. And what does this story mean for us as individuals today? Well, I guess I want to say that the good news in the story today is that if God can change, we can change. And I'm going to go out on a limb here today and guess there's not one single person in this room who doesn't have something about yourself personally or your life you wish you could change. But you've either told yourself or other people have told you that's not going to happen. You're stuck. Friends, if God can change, we can change. If we center our lives in love. So if you're a person here today struggling with something in your life, something personally, a difficult decision, you're struggling financially, you're struggling relationally, you're struggling what this faith thing even means to you, or if it means anything to you, you're struggling with who you are as a person, know that if you center yourself in love, forget all the rest of it, center yourself in God's hesed for you, God's unconditional grace and steadfast love, that anything is possible. That hope is possible. New life is possible. Because if God can change, we can change too. Let's pray together. Source of steadfast, amazing grace and love. We hear this story from our spiritual ancestors as they wrestled to try to make sense of their relationship with you. And we hear that they figured out that you were willing to work with them. That you wanted a dynamic relationship that changed with them as long as you and they kept love at the center. May we hear that challenge today. May we grow and change in our relationship with you, and may we always keep your love in front of us and in the midst of us. And all God's people say, amen.